Incredible and absolutely humiliating. The European Union has just signed an agreement with the United States that many experts are already calling one of the largest political capitulations in modern trade history. Just a few days ago, the European Commission was posturing as a tough negotiator, drawing red lines, calling August 1st the final deadline, threatening countermeasures, and demanding that the US back down. But now it has become clear. It was all just theater, empty threats, loud declarations with no substance. When the real negotiations began behind closed doors, they simply gave up, completely and without resistance. Watching European leaders then try to explain it all away was almost painful. They scrambled for excuses, spoke of a difficult situation, pleaded for understanding, as if the EU, with all its economic weight, had no arguments left against Washington. And what did they get in the end? Nothing. Not a single meaningful concession. The American 50% tariff on European steel remains in place. The issue was not even raised. Instead, headlines trumpet a 15% tariff as if it were a breakthrough. But anyone who follows the situation can see it's just a smokescreen. A century-old industry continues to be crushed. Worse still, there are now growing fears that Trump will raise tariffs again later. And honestly, why wouldn't he? The EU has just shown it's willing to surrender under pressure. They not only lost leverage, they willingly gave up their dignity and key industries for a photo op that presents Trump as the winner. These 15% tariffs may just be the beginning. Experts are in shock, people are angry, and the European Commission has gone silent because they know exactly what happened. This was never a serious fight for Europe's interests. It was a retreat, neatly packaged for the media, so no one would look too closely. This deal is not just weak, it's shameful. And yet they're still trying to sell it as a success. Just a few weeks ago, European leaders were talking tough. They warned Trump, back off or face retaliation. They said it loud and clear, but behind the scenes, it was a different story. This past weekend, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen secretly met with Trump at his golf resort in Scotland. The meeting lasted just over an hour, and by the end of it, Europe had capitulated. Instead of demanding tariff reductions, the EU agreed to lock in Trump's 15% tariffs on most European goods. Yes, it's less than the previously threatened 30 or 50%, but let's be honest, it's still 3 times higher than the former level of 4 or 5%. What used to be called a temporary trade war is now the new normal. And worst of all, some industries got no relief at all. European steel and aluminum are still subject to 50% tariffs in the US. These issues weren't even discussed. EU leaders didn't fight for them, didn't demand changes, didn't even mention them, as if those sectors simply don't exist. So what did Europe get in return? Nothing beneficial for its exporters. No tariff cuts, no legal guarantees, no protection for its industries. Instead, the EU agreed to invest $750 billion into the American energy sector. And that wasn't enough. Europe also promised to invest another $600 billion into the US economy in the coming years. In the end, nearly $1.5 trillion are flowing into Washington, while the tariffs stay in place. This is not a balanced agreement. It is a capitulation disguised as diplomacy. Now, European leaders are desperately trying to portray the deal as a victory. Von der Leyen calls it a step towards stability. The German chancellor claims it was the best possible outcome, but across Europe, few believe it. The scale must be understood. Together, the EU and the US account for around 60% of the global economy. Europe's exports to the United States are enormous, from automobiles and pharmaceuticals to machinery and electronics. Entire industries depend on American buyers, and now those exports are burdened with additional costs and reduced profitability. The hardest hit are steel and aluminum producers. The devastating 50% tariffs remain in place, and these sectors were already barely staying afloat. Now they will have to survive under even greater pressure. Yet the agreement makes no mention of them, as if they simply do not exist. Despite this, EU officials publicly praise the deal, calling it a step forward. But for most observers, it's clear that this was a concession under pressure, not an achievement. Meanwhile, Trump is calling it the biggest deal in history, and he has every reason to be proud. He secured the EU's consent to higher tariffs, received a promise of massive investments, and gave nothing in return. All of this in just a single hour of negotiations. This was not the firm stance of a global power. It was a retreat now being sold to the public as peace. This is how influence is lost, step by step, deal by deal. And what's most alarming, the threat hasn't gone anywhere. All the power remains in Trump's hands. The agreement does nothing to stop him from raising tariffs again at any moment. Europe entered these negotiations with demands and exited with obligations. And the political fallout was immediate. Europe is being shaken by protests and political scandals. French Prime Minister François Bayrou did not hold back. In a fiery speech before the National Assembly, he called the agreement a blatant act of submission. This is not diplomacy. This is capitulation. We sacrificed our economic dignity to avoid a greater catastrophe. But it is still a catastrophe, he declared. His outrage spilled beyond the walls of Parliament. In Paris, spontaneous protests erupted in front of the US Embassy. Farmers, unions, and industry representatives took to the streets, calling the deal a surrender to Trump's bullying. In Germany, the reaction was no less severe. Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who initially supported the deal as a way to avoid harsher tariffs, was soon forced to backtrack under pressure from angry industrial leaders. "I am not satisfied with the outcome. The German economy will suffer serious damage. And that's not all. The entire EU will feel the consequences," he admitted. Germany's vast automotive industry remains particularly vulnerable. In the face of growing competition from electric vehicles, the added costs could push already fragile companies to collapse. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez also expressed disappointment. Although he formally supported the European Commission's efforts, he made it clear that this was no victory. The deal was signed without enthusiasm. Europe must wake up. We need to develop our own autonomy in trade, energy, and defense. We cannot keep bending under Washington's pressure, he said. The sense of betrayal is spreading rapidly across the continent. In Scotland, thousands of people marched, demanding that the deal be revoked. In Italy, demonstrators carried signs reading, "Europe is not for sale," and Trump's tariffs are economic terrorism. The populist Five-Star Movement immediately called for an emergency parliamentary session to discuss possible retaliatory measures against American goods. Even EU officials admit behind closed doors. They got nothing in return. So how did it come to this? According to the Wall Street Journal, the root cause was complete chaos behind the scenes. One senior EU official reportedly searched for crucial documents in a parking lot and connected to public Wi-Fi on a train en route to Scotland while key negotiations were underway. Everything was rushed. The threat of Trump raising tariffs loomed over the talks, and the European Commission, under pressure and unprepared, ended up signing what was later described as a pragmatic compromise. But critics insist it was a straightforward capitulation. Meanwhile, Washington is celebrating a victory. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told CNBC, "This is a recognition of the legitimacy of our trade grievances. The EU now understands that America will not sit idly by and watch its deficit grow." In simple terms, Trump imposed his terms and got what he wanted. Economists responded just as harshly. Bank of America warned that the deal could damage Europe's long-term competitiveness and called the shift toward American energy an act of economic suicide. Reuters mocked the idea that Brussels could control private energy contracts, especially since U.S. prices are higher than those in the Middle East or Russia. Analysts at Wolf Research noted that even if the deal reduces short-term uncertainty, Europe essentially got nothing. Even the typically restrained Financial Times wrote that the EU has opened the door to a new wave of coercive diplomacy from Washington, and the consequences are already being felt. Following the announcement, the euro fell by 1.3%. European stock markets, initially encouraged by the news of avoiding 30% tariffs, sharply declined by the end of the day. Investor optimism evaporated. Businesses are now scrambling to understand what the deal means for pricing, exports, and long-term strategy. Across the English Channel, however, an entirely different story is unfolding. Acting independently, the United Kingdom managed to secure better terms than the entire European Union. And this is not just a political twist, it is one of the most ironic chapters in modern trade diplomacy. The EU, which once prided itself on unity and economic clout, ended up accepting 15% tariffs, committing to billions in purchases of American energy and weapons. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom walked away from negotiations with better terms, fewer obligations, and something Europe lost at the table: its own dignity. This is not just about numbers, it is about leverage and who actually holds it. The EU entered the talks cornered and internally divided, while Britain, freed from sluggish Brussels bureaucracy, negotiated with Washington on its own terms. And it paid off. Their deal with the United States does not include unified tariffs, does not require massive purchases of American energy, and clearly protects key national industries: finance, pharmaceuticals, and aviation. While EU representatives were asking for deadline extensions and hastily gathering documents aboard trains, the British team negotiated calmly and precisely. And here's what Brussels finds hard to ignore: one country outplayed 27. Had Britain remained under EU governance, it would have been dragged into the same one-sided deal that is now sparking protests across Europe. Instead, it stayed out, secured a cleaner agreement, and preserved its strategic voice. Now, across Europe, the question is being asked louder than ever: what was the point of unity if it leads to submission? The EU was once envisioned as a counterweight to American influence. Today, it increasingly resembles a junior partner following instructions, sacrificing industries, and dressing up defeat as diplomacy. Judging by London's success, walking away from the performance may have been the wisest decision in decades. And as the dust settles, the world is watching to see who reacts next. Up next is Canada, and how it handles this challenge could set the tone for all future transatlantic negotiations. To follow the rest of this story, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is much more to come.